I'd like to welcome everybody to the webinar. Before we get started on the actual webinar, just one item. Wanted to make sure that everyone knew that all these webinars are recorded, and we post them via our website or Facebook or Twitter at our YouTube channel, as well as our blog. So in either place you can link to a recorded version of the webinar. So if you just want to go back for reference or review, it's there. People you know who may not have been able to attend can always view these later once we post them. We try to get them on typically within 24 hours, depending on what else is going on, but certainly within a couple days, if not sooner, at YouTube and our blog. And if you're not exactly sure where that is, just go to ZenoLink.com and you can find that on the webpage. So tonight we're going to be talking about designing an effective off-season training program using a PST, or what we call Progressive Skills Training. A couple quick notes before we get into the content. PST is something that we've developed around activity-specific coordination. If you're not familiar with PST or the concepts of Progressive Skills Training, I would recommend that you go to our YouTube channel or the blog and watch the PST primer. It's about 30 minutes, roughly, and it goes over the basics of PST, kind of just getting you up to speed with what PST is, how it's used, how it's different than traditional strength conditioning, and a little bit about the types of exercises that are used. So the basics are there at that PST primer. The other thing that I wanted to mention before we get into the content is just that tonight what I'm going to do is I'm going to go over the basics of using PST in an off-season program. So I'm not going to get into any specific sport, nor am I going to get into specific protocols, exercises, and progressions. I'm going to stay a little bit more general and talk more about the concept behind developing a program first. Later this fall, we'll get into using case studies with specific, not only sports, but specific areas of weakness to show you how we can attack an individual strengths and weaknesses with PST in more of a case study format, which is way more effective than trying to dump it all on you in one shot. And the thing you have to understand is that when we refer to this as progressive skills training, we refer to that progression not only in a workout or a session or over the course of phases or cycles, but also over the course of many phases and cycles. So a lot like the PST, learning about that takes some progression, takes a base of understanding, and then moving forward with the details. And that's what I'm going to try to lay out for you today. There's some key points to mention before we get started looking at the specific progressions. The first thing is that typical off-season training programs revolve around general strength conditioning. And there's nothing wrong with that. In fact, it's extremely important. You have to go through off-season in particular, go through a phase of rebuilding strength, mobility, and then power or speed on top of that. It's essential to any off-season program, and that is an important part of any program that you would want to put together with or without PST. If a physical screen like FMS, function movement screen, is used to assess, or some other type of screen is used to assess and individualize a program, that program will still focus on structural issue and not on activity-specific coordination. So the typical off-season program, the general strength conditioning programs, are based on what I would refer to as structure, not activity-specific coordination, but structure, building strength or mobility from a more anatomical, structural perspective. Even if the exercises are quote-unquote functional, if there isn't some idea of what the coordination pattern is and what the strengths and weaknesses of that individual are inside of that activity-specific coordination, then they can't be specifically functional. They can only be structural in nature. And again, not that anything's wrong with that. In fact, that's very important. But what happens is, and that leads us to the third point, these programs fail to produce significant results or gains in performance because they fail to address activity-specific coordination. So, and we've all, anyone who's played sports, anyone who's involved with sports now, has all done the more traditional off-season program. What we're talking about is the reason they fail is they don't fail to get the athlete in shape, maybe to add some strength, maybe to add a little bit of power in the gym, so to speak. But where they fail is to look at the activity-specific issues an individual athlete has within their own sport and address those activity-specific issues as a part of developing more efficient, more effective technique or movement pattern. So the reason the traditional off-season program quote-unquote fails to produce really significant improvement as you move into your next season is that they fail to identify and treat, so to speak, activity-specific breakdown. What PST is designed to do is to attack that missing component, not to eliminate strength and conditioning or coaching and technique development, but to fill the gap where there is very little going on, and that is conditioning or training within the realm of activity-specific coordination, looking at where the athlete, let's say a baseball swing or a tennis serve or whatever it might be, where the athlete breaks down in the coordination of performing the activity and specifically address that breakdown first through coordination and then secondly by augmenting that training with strength and conditioning type of movement or exercise. So again, just to reiterate, progressive skills training does not replace strength and conditioning. And when I say strength and conditioning, I mean everything that entails. I mean, I know that there's more than just working out in the gym off season, but so strength and conditioning really is just a placeholder for your more traditional off-season kind of development, which doesn't take into consideration specific activity-specific breakdown or activity-specific coordination breakdown. PST is instead not used to replace, but to enhance existing off-season programs so that we can produce significant performance gains. If I've heard it once, I've personally heard it thousands of times over the last 15 to 20 years. Athletes who work their butt off in the gym and really don't feel like they feel like they're in better shape, but they don't feel like they've really made any real progress in improving their ability to perform the activities that are crucial to their sport, whatever it might be. I've heard that over and over and over again. What PST is sort of like putting, that octane boost into the high-performance car. You're going to get out of the car more of the horsepower and use more of that horsepower to be effective on the course. So, if you think about it, what PST is really designed to do is to allow the athlete to make full use of their physical abilities, the abilities that they've honed and worked so hard on in the gym and your strength conditioning, functional, training stuff, as well as what they're doing with their coach on technique. It allows them to see the real fruits of that labor by impacting their ability to pull the two together, to use their physical ability to perform that technique at their most efficient possible level. So ideally, and we don't live in an ideal world, and we directly, as well as our partners who use our product, our ZenoLink product, which includes recommendations on PST and development of programs, they deal with all kinds of different scenarios. We deal with all kinds of different scenarios, shortened off seasons due to certain circumstances, injuries or playing schedules, all kinds of things impact how you try to structure your off-season program. Some sports have very small windows, some have larger windows. There's a lot of things you're dealing with. Younger athletes have, multiple sports they may be playing, where obviously your adult athlete or your professional athlete specialize on their one sport. So you have all kinds of different scenarios that you're dealing with. But ideally, an off-season PST program, which again dovetails with the existing programs, doesn't replace, would consist of essentially 3 roughly 4-week cycles, or what we would call phases. And that would be in an ideal world where you have an entire off season from, let's say, late fall all the way through the spring for, say, a summer sport, and then just reverse that for winter sports. So the way we would break this down would be into 3 fundamental phases, which would last roughly 4 to 6 weeks. Phase 1 is really our fundamental skill development phase. Okay, so if you're looking at it from a strength conditioning perspective, this is where you're just coming off your season, you've taken a little time off. Let's say we're talking about summer season, you've taken a little time off in the early fall, and then you're going to start easing back into your strength conditioning, developing a strength base, an endurance base, some mobility, kind of getting back into the swing of things. This is when we would do our phase 1 fundamental skill development phase. We always start with a ZenoLink 3D functional assessment so that we can accurately determine strengths and weaknesses in the activity-specific coordination. So we don't want to just do a functional movement screening. We don't just want to see how fast they run the 40 or how their vertical jump is or whatever other testing you might do. If they're a baseball player and we're looking specifically at hitting, we want to assess functional coordination or activity-specific coordination during the actual swing, or pitch, or tennis serve, or golf swing, and volleyball, whatever, serve, whatever it might be. So the first thing we're going to do is start with assessing the activity-specific coordination. From that assessment, we'll develop a very specific PST program, which is going to focus on training areas of weakness predominantly, but also capitalizing on areas of strength. Our main focus, though, is to get the areas of weakness up to par with the other areas of the movement. So the PST program is going to look, especially during phase 1, at the weaknesses in the activity-specific coordination or the functional movement pattern, and design exercises around improving that weakness. The PST program would typically consist, in a phase 1 type scenario, of maybe 2 to 3 sessions, no more than 3 sessions per week. They would be no more than 20 to 30 minutes, and again, we would perform this for roughly 4 to 6 weeks. As I have already indicated, the best time for phase 1 type training, although we can work around any scenario, is really in the late fall, early winter, just before the holidays. Take a couple months to start to really take the time, very simply and very straightforward, work on very small units of movement that are areas of weakness in the activity-specific coordination of whatever the activity might be. So an example, again, I'm not going to get into specific exercises for specific sports. We'll do that in the form of case studies, as we get into the late fall and early winter. We'll go through a lot of this stuff. But just in general, the way a phase 1 progression might work. First, activity-specific weakness. Let's use the example of a breakdown in core differentiation, or what you might refer to as pelvis to upper torso coordination. So let's say one of the weaknesses we see, and this can be true of virtually any, especially distal and exercise, but even in running and cycling and sports that are a little bit more endurance-based, we may see a breakdown in the ability to coordinate the body between essentially the pelvic girdle and the upper thoracic or the upper torso, or be able to essentially, core differentiate. The PST prescription then for this particular weakness would say, for example, would include rooting exercises, which would really be our functional balance exercises. So you can, go in the gym and working on all kinds of balance-based exercise, but not be able to use your quote-unquote balance to produce functional movement patterns with the legs. In other words, create ground reaction forces that produce certain torque patterns or force patterns that essentially move the pelvis in rotational, whether it be on the bike or on the gym floor, on the grass, or whatever it might be. So what we would do with the PST would be implement activity-specific rooting exercises that emphasize functional balance. How do we use our ability to connect to the ground, our balance, and create ground reaction forces that will facilitate better differentiation, or start by creating better differentiation by essentially moving the pelvis more effectively. Then we would then look at core differentiation exercises specifically, and this would be our functional core strength. So you can go in the gym and do all kinds of core strengthening, whether it be your more static variations of bridges and planks, and whether it be yoga-based or Pilates, or all kinds of different ways to strengthen that structure. We want to take that structure and teach the body neuromechanically how to use that structure to perform the activity, and in particular to differentiate or coordinate between the pelvis and the upper torso. So we would prescribe very simple, very straightforward exercise that focus on very specific units of movement in rooting or connection to the ground and core differentiation. Over the course of that 4 to 6 weeks, the progressions would be very simple and very straightforward. Our main focus on this is not intense workout, but is to really focus on very specific units of movement and teach the body how to perform that movement in very small, isolated way. And the type of progressions that we would use here would be using some sort of cueing to facilitate the movement. Sometimes we use a Swiss ball between the legs. You know, there's a lot of different ways that we can kind of cue that activity to gradually eliminating the cues. So teaching the body first how to move with some cueing, and then gradually eliminate the cues over the course of 4 to 6 weeks, so that by the end of the 4 to 6 weeks, we don't have a lot of cueing, if any cueing, and we're really relying on the person to facilitate the entire movement on their own, which would be the ideal case. Now understand, just jumping into a complex movement ensures failure. The body cannot, if you can't differentiate between the pelvis and the upper torso, and you try to give somebody a complex activity like throwing a baseball or serving a volleyball or, you know, ground stroke, a tennis ground stroke or something, and try to teach them how to do that in a complex movement with a lot of variables and a lot of parameters to control, you'll get nowhere. So what we do is keep these exercises extremely simple, keep them very focused, very low intensity, but very high in terms of neural adaptation or neuromechanical adaptation. Okay, from a phase 1, which we would typically do in the late fall, early winter, you know, 4 to 6 weeks before the holidays really kick in, phase 2 now is advanced skill development. These are the phases. This is the phase that we would look at doing in really the dead of winter, after the holidays, you know, where, you know, you can be focused and put your 4 to 6 weeks in without a lot of distractions, so to speak. Again, we're going to use a ZenoLink 3D functional assessment to determine strengths and weaknesses, and maybe most importantly, to identify changes we've made in phase 1 training. If we did our phase 1 training correctly, we should see improvement in movement patterns. Sometimes we see dramatic improvement, but even if it's not dramatic, we should see some improvement. And we want to mark what improvement we've made and sort of redefine where our strengths and weaknesses are. Even if they still remain the same areas, they should have changed and advanced enough that we would want to change our scope a little bit. So we want to start every phase by assessing where the person is in their functional movement pattern, if they're in their activity-specific coordination. Now, in this case, in phase 2, the PST program is going to focus on, again, training areas of weakness. But in this case now, the PST, just a pure functional exercises, the activity-specific kind of exercises, will be augmented by strength and functional exercises. And I use both of those because we're going to use some generic exercises and we're going to use some more complicated functional exercises, and we're going to augment what we're doing with the activity-specific training, which is really more the specific PST exercise. And sort of create a more involved, more aggressive, but still skill-based program, skill development-based program. The PST will advance more quickly and more dynamically. In this case, the PST program is going to move more to really no more than 2 sessions per week. They're going to be a little bit longer. They're going to be a little bit more involved, and we don't want to overdo it. They're also doing other things. And this isn't the only thing you're going to be doing. Plus, we found through trial and error mostly, and then research, obviously, that the body tends to adapt and learn patterns more quickly especially when they become a little more intense, when there is some recovery period. Just like you would in a strength conditioning program, you want that recovery. The nervous system and neural adaptations are more effective in taking hold if there's some recovery. So 2 sessions per week. The sessions are going to be a little bit longer, definitely more intense. And again, we're looking at roughly 4 to 6 weeks. And remember, this is our ideal. And as I've indicated, this is a phase that would take place in essentially the dead of the winter, the January, February time frame. So an example of phase 2 progression. Now we're going to stick with the fact the activity-specific weakness being a breakdown in core differentiation or powerless upper torso coordination. So we stay with the same idea, the same focus. Now what we're going to do is we're going to augment the more PST or activity-specific exercises with other types of exercises, not necessarily, again, to replace the strength and conditioning, but to augment the advancement of or enhance the advancement of the motor development. So, for example, if we're talking about rooting exercises and functional balance, we're going to throw in some leg-based strength and functional type exercises. So in this case, simply we may add in, typically we do these with body weight only. We don't really typically add weight into the equation, except if we're trying to enhance appropriate awareness of something or feeling of something. So we're not going to typically use a lot of weight. That's the strength and conditioning part of their program. This is the motor skill development part. But we may do things like a deep squat, and we use the deep squat essentially body weight only, but to enhance their feeling of ground reaction force, normal force into the ground, pushing through the whole of the foot rather than rocking to the toes or the outside of the foot or the heels, learning how to use the legs to drive the power process or to drive the squat, use the pelvis and the lower core to control that drive while maintaining essentially an isometric torso, kind of stability or position in terms of in terms of posture as they're going through the squat. So we really use it to augment certain feelings more than strength train the legs. We can also throw in single leg stuff like alternating forward lunges to advance the feeling of compression and shear, while again driving with the leg, controlling with the pelvis and lower torso. Or lower core, and stabilizing the spine in a more isometric fashion. So we're using exercises that are more traditional in nature, or a little bit more like your standard functional exercises, to provide additional proprioceptive awareness and additional neuromechanical training. We would then go into rooting exercises. Again, our functional balance exercises, but here we'd be more dynamic. We'd move from simple rooting exercises like a press forward or a fall forward, catch yourself for a pitcher, things like that, to more dynamic, using those base movements, more dynamic, more complex functional balance exercises, but again, staying in the realm of the activity-specific motion. Again, then we move to our core-based stuff, and again, if we're looking at creating core differentiation exercises, our core-based strength functional exercises can be, again, things like, we use diagonal sit-ups, like the beginning of a Turkish get-up, say, for example, Russian twist. Or we can also do things like push-ups or high plank to low plank with knee blast. So you get, you're stabilizing the core, like you would in most activities to sort of isometrically stabilize an axis of rotation, and then you're introducing diagonal patterns at the same time. So there's many variations of more traditional type exercises or more functional based exercises that will augment the core development, but then we move right into our activity specific exercises, which may be, a half swing, say for example in golf, a half swing into an impact bag using a Swiss ball to isolate the core. Or, in pitching we may work from a stride, isolated lower body stride position, doing half throws from there to isolate the core. So, we're going to move from our more strength and functional based exercises directly into activity specific exercises. But again, the emphasis here is in base and skill development and teaching the body how to move more efficiently. Even though we're being more aggressive about it, it's still very much motor learning and skill development based. The progressions here are going to be more complex and more dynamic. So, an example, linking simple movements into more complex movements. In phase one, we're just doing these simple little units of movement, and we're satisfied with that. In phase two, where we're more aggressive about what we're trying to accomplish, we're going to take simple movements and start linking those simple movements together into more complex movements. We also move from slow movements and kind of more foundational learning type patterns into more complex faster movement. So we start to move from slow into some speed. We're not necessarily looking to develop power yet, but we want to start moving at higher speeds and starting to link small units of movement into more complex movements as we do that. So the progressions over the course of that 4 to 6 weeks are going to be more complex and more dynamic. The last phase of an off-season program, phase 3, is essentially going to be speed development. Now, again, you got to think of this as the motor skill part of your off-season program, not the strength conditioning part. So, but they can dovetail into the speed development phase of your conditioning program as well, and you can get the most out of both if you do it that way. Again, as we start phase 3, we're going to use a ZenoLink 3D functional assessment to, again, determine strengths and weaknesses. And again, most importantly, determine what changes we've made in phase 2, where we stand, mark it objectively, and quantify the changes so that we know where we want to progress with our speed development phase, which really then brings the athlete up into starting of the season. The PST program is going to focus on developing speed, but speed through enhanced coordination with secondary emphasis on continuing some skill development. Now, the key to developing speed through enhanced coordination is a little different than developing power through muscular development or through structural improvement. And the difference is, if we want to develop more distal and speed, whether we're swinging a bat or a lacrosse stick or a golf club or whatever it might be, we want to look at things like your ability to brace the body and accelerate the extremity and the implement from like a super stiffening or a bracing perspective. We want to teach the body how to use that brace to accelerate the extremity. So now we're starting to take our basic skill development and we're starting to be very dynamic, very ballistic about it, and employ speed training principles into that skill development. The PST, which is more the activity-specific exercise, is going to be augmented by speed or power exercise as well as continued functional exercise. And again, the PST will now advance very quickly. We've only got 4 to 6 weeks to ramp somebody up through a cycle to really get them into ballistic speed mode. And this is where they're really going to be performing exercises, the PST in particular, at speed. We do a little bit of that in phase 2, but in phase 3, we are performing exercises at the speed at which they're going to be throwing a baseball, hitting a golf ball, serving a tennis ball. So we're really activity-specific. We have heightened and honed specificity by this phase. So we're really working in the realm of the activity as we move into this phase 3. Much like phase 2, the program will consist of 2 sessions a week, and those sessions are going to be roughly 30 minutes plus or minus. They may be up to 45 minutes, but we try to keep them short and to the point. And again, we're performing this for 4 to 6 weeks. Lastly, as I've already indicated, this would be done in typically your late winter, early spring, March, April timeframe, getting them prepared to go into season. Okay, so some examples of what we're talking about. We're keeping the activity-specific weakness as a breakdown in core differentiation or pelvis and upper torso coordination. Now, the PST prescription would include now leg-based speed power functional exercises. So what we would now want to do here is say move from maybe doing a deep squat, some lunges and things like that, to doing like jump squats, beginning level plyometrics. And again, not to replace what you're doing in your strength conditioning speed phases, but mostly as a preparatory phase or kind of almost like movement prep type phase prior to going into the activity-specific speed development stuff. So we might use stuff like jump squats, little ankle bounces or toe bounces. We might use some things like tuck jumps or hurdle jumps, things where we're using the lower body explosively in preparation for using it explosively in activity-specific patterns. And that's where we move into our lower body activity-specific speed and power exercises and functional balance. So in this case, what we might start to do now is use ballistic plyometric-based exercise. So we take half swings or partial throws or partial serve movements, and we start to do them at speed. And we also can then employ different variations of short response and long response plyos, different variations of underweighted, overweighted training. But we start doing the exercises that we left off with in phase 2 on a very ballistic level. So we're doing ballistic, plyometric-based swings and throws and functional, activity-specific kind of movement patterns, in this case, specific to the lower body. Then we'll move into core-based power, speed, functional exercise. Now, here you can do all kinds of things, but one of the things I wanted to suggest is that, you'd be surprised when you start getting into complex movement and you're trying to facilitate and augment certain motor development, you'd be surprised at what can be clumped into core-based power, speed, functional exercise. Like, for example, a really good, there's obviously a lot of med ball stuff and things you can do that are obvious core-based kind of power, speed exercises, but what I've found to be really effective for, again, preparing the body to move diagonally or rotationally in a ballistic way are single-arm kettlebell exercises or variations of those things. So when you do swings and cleans and snatches and the variations of those movements with one arm and a kettlebell, you actually get a stimulation in terms of diagonal movement patterns or multiplanar movement patterns where you're emphasizing rotation. If you do two-arm, obviously you're going to be more planar. But if you do one arm, let's say just a basic swing, and we tested this using the 3D motion stuff, you actually are going to get a ripple effect of the legs driving up out of the swing, creating a rotational dynamic at the pelvis, which then connects to a rotational dynamic at the upper torso, which then facilitates the arm swing. So you're actually emphasizing power-based, multiplanar, kind of rotational, core-based kind of stuff that also involves the lower body, which is perfect for what we're trying to facilitate. So don't think, think outside of the box when you do these things. And again, we test all this stuff, so we know what works and what doesn't work in terms of eliciting certain movement patterns. And then we go into our core activity, specific power exercises, emphasizing differentiation. So now we may look at doing short response plyometric golf swings into an impact bag, or a long response baseball swing with a towel snap into a heavy bag, or we may now start to take the impact bag out and do full swing through. We can do that with, whip implements like a towel or a rope. We can do it with more rigid implements like, underweighted, overweighted clubs and bats and things like that. So we start, but the idea would be to specify or identify the core differentiation pattern by sort of encapsulating the movement. Sometimes we use Swiss ball between the knees to isolate. Sometimes we isolate the movement by forcing sort of like a long response with momentum. So, there's different ways that we can do that. But the idea is using the combination to facilitate activity-specific ballistic exercise, which its primary focus is to train the body to move in pattern, but now at speed. And as a function of that, coordinate more efficiently to create speed, whether that be speed in distal and acceleration activity, or even in endurance-based exercises like, activities like running and cycling, distance running and road cycling and things like that. We found that being able, if you look at each sort of, revolution or each gait cycle as its own little sort of ballistic output, and train that way, you're much more effective, even training the endurance-based activities, if you look at each one of those as ballistic outputs. So we do a lot of, even with endurance athletes, a lot of ballistic training as a function of retraining the nervous system and creating better movement patterns. I get so many amazing case studies to share with you guys over the course of the winter, incredible success stories using these progressions and using different variations of these things that will really be eye-openers for you and really open a whole new world of enhancing what you're doing with your athletes, whether you're a coach or strength conditioning or physical therapist or whatnot. Just real quick to finish up with here, phase 3. Again, like phase 2, progressions are going to be complex and dynamic. We're going to take advantage of increasing intensity using plyometrics, and of course some underweighted, overweighted type training, and mix it all in a nice progression so that by the end of that 4 to 6 weeks, the athlete is not only peaked physically through their strength conditioning program, but peaked neuromechanically as well to coordinate the best that they're going to coordinate going into season. And we don't worry about making too much strides in season. We try to maintain, and we try, to enhance here and there. If you want to cycle them through for a key point in their season, we can, employ a mini variation or mini version of the phase 1 through 3 program in a very condensed period of time to try to, peak them out in the middle of the season. But we really just say, okay, here's where we're at going into season. We're going to maintain. We're going to help them use that. They're going to be busy playing and practicing, and then we look to next fall to get them back into an off-season program. Okay, here's the take-home message, and then I'll wrap up. The take-home message. The number one take-home message for me is do not generalize. I can't tell you, after going through this stuff, how many times I've been asked, well, is there just some general exercises my athletes can do based on what you're talking about? And my response, and hopefully don't take it the wrong way, but is why on earth would you want to do that? That's what is already being done. What we want to do is look specifically at what an athlete's strengths and weaknesses are. That's like going to the doctor and saying, oh, don't do the MRI, don't do the CAT scan, don't do the blood work, just give me some general solution, I'm sure it'll be fine. If you have the ability to look at the individual specific strengths and weaknesses and identify their specific needs and address those specific needs, you're going to get considerably more gain in a considerably shorter period of time. If you generalize, it's going to be just as hit or miss as the standard programs they're on. So don't generalize. I know the tendency is going to say, oh, well, not everyone's going to be able to get tested and go through this whole process. I understand that. But that's the whole point of it, that if we generalize, we do the athlete a disservice. I could understand if this type of technology was still reserved to the research facility, or there are very, very high-end, organizations, but it's not. It's out there. It's available. It's cost-effective. It should be used. And so my biggest thing is, if you want to see gains, if you want to see your athlete get better, do not generalize programs. And then the simpler take-home messages are use evaluation of strengths and weaknesses in the activity-specific coordination to shape the off-season program. If you understand what their individual strengths and weaknesses are, you can take a standard strength conditioning program, which is still an important part of the off-season program, and you can tailor that more general strength conditioning to be more specific to their individual needs, activity-specific needs. You can take standard exercises and make them way more effective towards the end goal if you understand what their strengths and weaknesses are and what those exercises, may do in addition to just getting them in shape, in terms of movement. Use PST to train specific aspects of activity-specific coordination. That was the whole theme of tonight. Use the PST to train motor development as well as the fitness aspect, or the structural aspect of the athlete. And then use strength and conditioning to enhance the efforts of training activity-specific coordination and not just to get in shape. And again, I generalize that. I mean, I know that it's not just getting in shape, but, use a knowledge of what the individual strength and weaknesses are and what the general strength conditioning exercises have to offer so that you can enhance the efforts of the person's ability to create bat speed or pitch velocity, not just get them in better shape. Because, obviously they have to be in better shape. They have to be, prepared cardiovascularly and strength and mobility-wise to go into a season. But they aren't going to advance their level of play unless they start to advance their level of movement. And so we need to really guide what we do based on what their ability to perform the activities are. So, again, my number one take-home message is, I know it's really easy to say, oh, I could just, everyone's going to benefit from this exercise. Yeah, that's true. But, man, I tell you, you just won't get the benefit out of it that you could. And it's a real shame when the technology is available. It's, again, like I said, it's walking into the doctor's office and skipping the MRI or the CAT scan. See, just do what the general what everybody gets, I'm sure that'll be fine. That, and we don't want to do that. That's the whole point, is we're moving past that. Technology is allowing us, like in every other aspect of our lives, whether it's Bluetooth or GPS or whatever, technology is allowing us to move past where we've been and to expand our horizons, and that's what we're talking about this evening. So I'm going to wrap up here with this. If you have questions, I see there might be a couple questions that were submitted. I'll look at those questions. I'll try to answer them in email or in subsequent webinars. I try not to answer questions during the webinar itself, and I'll try to either respond to you directly via email or in some other way, where I have the time to actually look at your question and answer it. But I appreciate you participating in our webinar this evening, and I hope this is that foundation to start to open your mind to looking at the off-season program as more than just getting in shape, and also look at what you're doing, in quote-unquote functional training as not always necessarily functional. Just because it looks like it might sort of be functional doesn't mean that it is. We have to really take a hard look at what the activity demands are from a neuromechanics perspective and what the individual athlete does or doesn't do with respect to those demands before we can truly be functional about our exercises. And then in those cases, some exercises look like, the activity, and some don't, but they are still activity-specific exercises. So again, this is a foundation. We're going to get into more as we move forward, but think about attacking your off-season program, not just from strength and conditioning or getting in shape and the structural component, but in terms of activity-specific coordination. I guarantee you that you will see dramatic improvement in your athletes. Regardless, as long as they comply and they work out with you, you will see dramatic improvement in their ability to perform, not just in their athletic ability, their physical conditioning, but their ability to perform the activities that are important to the sport. So again, I appreciate you joining our webinar. Hopefully it was informational and hopefully it was eye-opening. If you have questions after the fact, you watch the webinar online at YouTube or whatever, and you have questions, just email me directly, and I'll do my best in a timely fashion to get back to you via email. And as always, if the questions are more complex, we can always schedule some time for a quick meeting or a phone call or whatnot. So please, if you have any questions, ask them. It's important for all of us, not just you, but for me to understand what questions are out there and find better ways to explain this information as we move forward. Appreciate everyone. Have a great day or evening, depending on where you're at, and look forward to having you at our next webinar next week. Thanks a lot.